Hi there, this is Kevin Patton with a brief audio introduction to episode number 62 of the A&P Professor podcast, also known as TAPP Radio, an audio laboratory for teachers of human anatomy and physiology. Well, this is a preview of the upcoming full episode, which is episode number 62, and it's titled Another Big Year in Teaching Anatomy and Physiology. And that parallels the title from an episode we did about a year ago called A Big Year. And that was a debriefing, a review, a look back of the first year of the A&P Professor podcast. And so we're going to do that again in episode number 62. And so it's all about debriefing. It's all about reflecting. It's all about looking back and reviewing what we did. So we're going to take a moment to think about, to remind ourselves about how we as teachers can debrief in a way that is constructive and helpful and affirming. And then we're going to dive right in and summarize a whole year of this podcast. Well, okay, not exactly summarize everything, but at least sit at the scenic overlook and take in the broad view of everything, pointing out a few of the most interesting things that happened along the way over this last year. The free distribution of this podcast is sponsored by the Master of Science in Human Anatomy and Physiology instruction, the HAPI degree. I'm on the faculty of this program, and guess what? We're looking for another online adjunct professor with extensive experience in teaching undergraduate A&P to join our tight-knit, fun-loving, and hard-working faculty. Check out the job posting for this position or details about this online graduate program at nycc.edu/HAPI, that's HAPI, or click the link in the show notes or episode page. And to find the job post, just scroll to the bottom of the landing page and click Employment Opportunities. It's already been posted in the free TAPP app, too. Whether you're looking to join us as a learner or as faculty, be sure to mention that you heard about it here. Well, it's time once again for Word Dissection, where we practice what we all do in our teaching and take apart words and translate their parts to deepen their understanding. And since this is the preview to the Looking Back episode, I thought we would take this time to look back over the terms that we dissected over the last year. And you know what? I counted them up. There's 107 of them. That's amazing. 107 terms we dissected, we took apart. And as I just said a moment ago, sometimes they're terms that are very familiar to us, and sometimes they're terms that are new because they've just been coined in the literature, or they're things that we just don't run across much being A&P teachers. And you know what? I'm going to make that 108. I'm going to go ahead and dissect one new term, or at least one term that we haven't dissected before, and it's a term that is very, very familiar to all of us, and that is the word dissect. If we break that apart, we have two main word parts, dis, D-I-S, and sect. And dis, the first word part, literally means apart, or away, or asunder, or having a negative or reversing force on whatever other word part it's attached to. And then sect, that second word part, literally means cut. So we put it together, and dissect means cut apart. Which makes sense, right? I mean, that's what we do when we dissect something. We're cutting it apart so that we can understand it in a different way than we can possibly understand it when that thing is whole. Now, in anatomy and physiology, we normally think of dissecting as dissecting a body or an organ so that we can understand it better. That is, cutting it apart, at least some of it gets cut apart or cut away, and we can see what's going on. But what we've been doing, of course, in these previews is dissecting terms. So we're cutting the terms apart into their word parts so that we can get a little bit different understanding than we have when we're looking at them whole. And even that word dissect, when we pull it apart and put it back together again, I think we can understand it more deeply and think about it in a different way than we would have if we hadn't stopped to really be mindful of what the word parts are. Another aspect of this particular dissection, dissecting the word dissect, is that I think it kind of helps inform our pronunciation of the term. Now, I've been using the pronunciation dissect, but you might use the pronunciation dissect. And you know what? When you look in the dictionaries, even the medical dictionaries, you will see that both terms or both pronunciations, I should say, are acceptable. And so neither one of them is more correct than the other in terms of pronunciation. But I do have a preference, which you now know what it is. It's dissect. Because I think that is a little more clearly tied to its word parts, dis and sect. Remember, we have two S's in there, so they come apart in between those two S's. If we use the pronunciation dissect, then it sounds like the first word part is die, which means something different than dis. It could mean to, for example, or it could mean through, or there's other interpretations, but it's not the same as dis. So dissect could be misleading to a beginner, especially a beginner who's starting to pay attention to how word parts are put together to form scientific terms. And so that's why I prefer dissect over dissect. But you know what? Missouri, it doesn't matter. It's okay. I'm just pointing out why I have that preference. So let's go through the 107 dissected terms. No, we're not going to go through all 107 of them, but I am going to mention all 107 of them. And I'll stop occasionally in this list just to mention one or two things about them, but we're not going to actually do the dissection. But I think this is a good exercise to go back and review and to reinforce what we learned. Because remember, we're all about long-term learning here, and it might remind you of something that you might want to go back to and look at again, or listen to again, I should say. So in episode 37, we dissected 5 terms. Neurogenesis, and boy, remember, neurogenesis has come up a lot over the last 2 years in this podcast because of different discoveries that are being made about neurogenesis in adult brains. So we have neurogenesis, and then we talked about some emerging ideas in autonomic pathways. So we dissected the terms craniosacral and thoracolumbar. We also dissected the term hematopoietic stem cell, or HSC. And then we talked about the term rosette, specifically anatomical rosette, because we talked about it as a tool for helping students get oriented to anatomical positioning. And then in episode 38, we dissected the term chimera and chimerism, and those came up actually in the most recent episode, the episode before this one as well. So we did that one twice. And then allograft is another term we did in episode 38, and progenitor cell. Then in episode 39, we dissected a very, very familiar term, actually several very familiar terms. One was cerebellum. We dissected muscle, which oddly means little mouse, so we talked about that a little bit. We dissected the term tendon and anglicized, because we were talking about terminology and how we anglicize Latin terms sometimes. And then in episode 40, we dissected the term eponym and toponym. Remember, a toponym is named after a place, whereas an eponym is a term that is named after a person. And then we talked about Haversian canal and even the pronunciation of Haversian canal, which is an eponym. And then we went on to episode 41, where we dissected duodenum or duodenum, and we talked about the plural forms. There's more than one plural form, and then hippocampus. And then in episode 42, well, that was the Kevin's unofficial guide to the HAPS annual conference, 2019 edition. And so we dissected the terms conference and the proper noun Portland, because the meeting last year was in Portland, Oregon. We found out it was actually named after a different city named Portland. And then we have episode 43, where we had a long list of terms that we dissected, all having to do with anatomic variation, which was the topic of that episode. And so we looked at the difference between the terms anatomic and anatomical, and why there are two different versions like that we used. And we likewise compared physiologic with physiological. And then we looked at the terms situs inversus, situs solatus, levocardia, dextrocardia, and fabella, plural fabellae, which is a bone that exists in actually an increasing number of people in the knee joint. And then we went on to episode 44, where we dissected the terms gamification, zygote, old friend of ours that zygote, we use that term a lot. Tripolar, which is kind of weird. We don't really run across that much, but it was in one of the news updates that we talked about in the full episode. And in that news update, we also talked about pronucleus, so we dissected that term, locus, and blastocyst, another old friend that we've used a lot in our teaching and learning of anatomy and physiology. And then we have episode number 45, where we dissected an old and dear friend, and that is homeostasis and thermostat. And we looked at the term sodium and its origin, and also the origin of the symbol Na for natrium. And then we likewise did the same with potassium and looked at the origin of the symbol K for kalium. In episode 46, we talked about chondrocyte, another often used term in A&P, and chondroprogenitor cell, which may not be so frequently used in A&P teaching. And then we dissected the terms epiphysis and epiphyseal plate. We dissected the term amnesia, and we dissected the term measles, which we found out literally means specks, which makes sense. We talk about measles, right? And then we went on to episode number 47, where we dissected the term artificial intelligence, the term microbe, and microbiome. In episode 51, and notice I skipped from 47 to 51 because we had some special summer classic episodes in between there. So in episode 51, we dissected the term transparency because we were talking about transparency not only in this podcast, but why we should have transparency in our course and really tell students why our course is designed the way it is and why our policies are the way they are. And then we also dissected the terms olfaction, gustation, and subventricular zone, or SVZ. In episode 52, we looked at the word case, as in case study, and its origin. We dissected the term hypercalcemia, the term parcellation, and looked at the origin of the word atlas. And we also dissected the term epigenome. And then in episode 53, we dissected metastasis, extracellular vesicle, exosome, oncosome, and transcytosis. Remember, transcytosis is a process of going across a cell, that is, through the middle of a cell. And then in episode 54, we contrasted the terms isovolumic and isovolumetric, and that had to do with a change in terminology in the HAPS learning outcomes. And similarly, for a similar reason, I should say, we compared the terms hemopoiesis and hematopoiesis. We also dissected the term vaccination and dissected the term CD8 cell. And in episode 55, we looked at the term perineum and peritoneum and talked about the fact that they're very close to one another, but they mean very different things. And some really commonly used terms in A&P, and that is femur and fibula. And we also looked again at that word case, but this time not in the context of a case study, but this time in the context of letter case, that is uppercase letters and lowercase letters, because we were talking about spelling and proper use of terms and so on, and we wanted to talk about how to capitalize terms properly when using scientific terminology. Then in episode 56, we looked at the origin or the meaning of the terms formative and summative as they relate to different kinds of assessment. And we broke down the term practical, as in a lab practical, a lab test. And we dissected the term rheumatoid arthritis. And we looked at a fairly newly discovered form of RNA called yRNA, so we looked at that term. And we looked at the term glycan and some terms related to it in the story that was told in the full episode. So besides glycan, we had oligosaccharide, we had N-glycan and O-glycan, and Oh my gosh, I can't. Why can't I say that? Did I have trouble in the episode too? I'm going to have to go back and listen again to that. Glycosylation. Okay. I think Susie collected them down by the seashore, didn't she? Or Peter Piper picked them or something. Glycosylation. Okay, I guess I need to use that word more so that it just flows off my tongue like carbaminohemoglobin does. And then in episode 57, we revisited some terms that we had come up in the previous year and we looked at, and that is syllabus and syllabi and syllabuses, which is, yes, a legitimate, correct pluralization of the term syllabus. Syllabi is okay too, and that's what I think most of us use, but syllabuses is correct as well. And then in episode 58, we talked about anosmia, we talked about cribriform plate, we dissected polydendrocyte, oligodendrocyte, the NG2 cell or NG2 glia, and figured out what NG2 means. And then we took a very ordinary term that everybody knows, even outside of anatomy physiology, and that is flashcard. But we kind of extended our conversation a little bit and learned that flashcards evolved from an old learning tool called the Hornbook. And so you might want to go back to episode 58 if you want to learn about that. And then episode 59, we looked at the terms obverse and reverse because we were still talking about flashcards, and those are terms that are useful when you're discussing how flashcards are used. And then we looked at the term mnemonic, which had been used in a lot of episodes up until that point, but this was the first opportunity we had to dissect it. Mnemonic as in a mnemonic phrase or any other kind of mnemonic device or tool that we would use for memorizing things. And then we also dissected the term mnemonic because a lot of people spell mnemonic as if it were the word mnemonic. And mnemonic and mnemonic mean very different things. Mnemonic means relating to the airways. Mnemonic means relating to memory. And so, yeah, they are somewhat similar. And they both have a silent letter at the beginning. So I think that's why they're so often confused. But they are two different terms. And then we also dissected the term pseudogene in episode 59, or preview episode 59. Then in preview episode 60, we dissected the term allostasis and allostatic. And then we dissected the term emoji and looked at the word emoticon. And we also dissected the term cumulative. Then in episode 61, chimera came up again, and forensic, and apoptosis, and we talked about the controversy surrounding the pronunciation of apoptosis. And then we discussed Wi-Fi, which we learned is a registered trademark. So, man, 107 terms, and I made it 108. A lot of terms there that we dissected over the last year. And so now I think we can better see that when we do just a few word dissections at a time in our classes, that over the course of many classes, over one semester and then the next semester in A&P 1 and A&P 2, it really gives the students a lot of examples. And of course, those are just examples that get the students started on doing their own word dissections. This podcast is sponsored by HAPS, the Human Anatomy and Physiology Society, promoting excellence in the teaching of human anatomy and physiology for over 30 years. And don't forget, February 21st, it's coming up soon, and that's the deadline to get the early bird rate for the HAPS annual conference in Ottawa, Ontario this May. It's also the deadline to submit a proposal for a poster or a workshop at the conference. I hope I'll see you there. Just go visit HAPS at theapprofessor.org/HAPS. That's HAPS. Okay, I'll tell you right from the start, I don't have a new book club recommendation for this preview. And the reason is because this is a looking back preview. So I'm going to quickly run through the books that were recommended over the last year. And there were 25 of them, so they add up, right? And 5 of those came directly from listeners. Now, a few more than that, I was reminded of these books by people who happened to be listeners, but I saw some comment that they made on Twitter or Facebook or in an email to me or something like that, but they weren't specific recommendations for the book club. So let's go through what some of them are. In episode 37, we recommended the book Nonsense on Stilts, How to Tell Science from Bunk by Massimo Pigliucci. And then episode 38 was Small Teaching. One of my favorite teaching books of all time is called Small Teaching, Everyday Lessons from the Science of Learning. And it's by James Lang, who has written several really good books on teaching. But what I like about Small Teaching is he really takes it from the perspective of, here is some things that are evidence-based that we can do in just tiny dribs and drabs. We don't have to redo our whole course or even a whole section of our course or a whole unit of our course. We can just walk in fresh that day that we read about it and experiment with one or the other of these techniques. Episode 39, we talked about an old favorite of mine, and it is old book, called The Gift of Pain. And it's by Paul Brand, and it's based on a personal recommendation to me from another HAPS member back in the 1990s, John Martin, who generously funds the John Martin Scholarship in HAPS. He was talking to me about Paul Brand, who he had met and had heard him speak, and was talking about his book and how it relates to anatomy and physiology, but also people going into health careers. So that was in episode 39, preview episode 39. And then we have in episode 40, the recommendation, The Secret Language of Anatomy by Cecilia Brassett, Emily Evans, Isla Faye. And then in episode 41, I recommended Skeleton Keys, The Secret Life of Bone by Brian Switek. And episode 42 was another of my favorite books about teaching, and that is Make It Stick, The Science of Successful Learning by Brown and Rediger and McDaniel. And then episode 43, I mentioned a big, giant book. I mean, this is a huge book, but man, is it fun to flip through. And that is Bergman's Comprehensive Encyclopedia of Human Anatomic Variation. And that's by Tubbs, Shoja, and Lucas. That was based on a Twitter recommendation from Mike Pasco. And then episode 44, I recommended Stiff, The Curious Lives of Human Cadavers by Mary Roach, who has written several different books, some of which are going to appear on future episodes or future recommendations of the A&P Professor Book Club. She's a really, really great writer and does some excellent research and really tells an entertaining story. And this one was about, what happens to human bodies after we die. And that was based on a Twitter thread from Krista Rumpolsky. And then episode 45, I talked about a rather old book called Salt, A World History by Mark Kurlansky. And boy, I learned a lot from that book. And it doesn't sound like an interesting book, a book about salt, but it is. I mean, I'm a big salt fan anyway. But, I really liked that book. And then episode 46, we didn't have a book recommendation, but episode 47, we had Do Zombies Dream of Undead Sheep? A Neuroscientific View of the Zombie Brain by Verstinen and Wojtek. And that was recommended directly by listener Mindy Freed. And then the next 3 episodes didn't have a recommendation because those were classic episodes that I repeated. And then episode 51, the recommendation from my friend Margaret Reese was Trail Guide to Movement, Building the Body in Motion by Andrew Beal. And then episode 52 was a book by Sandeep Johar, and that was Heart, A History. And then 53, Prime Mover, A Natural History of Muscle by Steve Vogel. Episode 54 was Human Errors, A Panorama of Our Glitches from Pointless Bones to Broken Genes by Nathan Lentz. In preview episode 55, we had a recommendation from my friend Elizabeth Grenier for the book Endurance, My Year in Space, A Lifetime of Discovery by the astronaut Scott Kelly. And then in preview episode 56, I recommended The Miniature Guide to Critical Thinking, Concepts and Tools. And that's from the Thinker's Guide Library. And that's by critical thinking experts Richard Paul and Linda Elder. And it's a tiny little guide. That's why it's called the Miniature Guide. And you can go back to preview episode 56 to learn more about it. Then preview episode 57, I talked about the book Powerful Teaching, a relatively new book that just came out Well, sure, if it just came out, it would be a relatively new book, wouldn't it? It's called Powerful Teaching, Unleash the Science of Learning by Pooja Agarwal and Patrice Bain. And that was recommended by listener Kim Terry. And that's a great book. And then in preview episode 58, I talked about a book called The Body, A Guide for Occupants by Bill Bryson. And that was recommended by listener Marty Port, who also won the drawing for a Kindle 10 HD tablet. Because remember, I had that promotion going for a while for people who submit recommendations for the book club. And then in preview episode 59, I recommended the book Anatomists and Eponyms, The Spirit of Anatomy Past by Gilliland and Montgomery. And in episode 60, we talked about the book The End of Stress as We Know It by Bruce McEwen, because in the full episode, I had given kind of a toast to Bruce McEwen, who has just passed away recently. And then in the previous episode, episode 61, the previous to this one, I recommended a book that doesn't sound like a good book for AP teachers, but it is. Just trust me. It's called To Sell is Human, The Surprising Truth About Moving Others by Daniel Pink. And if you don't believe me, go back to preview episode 61 and listen to what I have to say about it. And I don't know, maybe it'll change your mind, maybe it won't, but it's your loss if you don't read it. It's really a good book. So yeah, 25 books, that's a lot to go through. And thank you if you're still with me here. But I think it's a good idea to go back through them to kind of jog our memories a little bit. Like, oh yeah, I reserved that book at the library. I wonder if it's still there for me. Or it's on my Kindle. I guess I want to get around to reading it. Or I forgot to order it at the library or at the bookstore. And maybe I want to do that. So some good reminders there. And it also is a good way to look at the wide variety of recommendations that we get in the AP Professor Book Club. And you can access not only these recommendations, but all the prior recommendations, and of course those that will be coming moving forward at the approfessor.org/bookstore. Hey, you probably forgot about that survey that I've been taking that's part of my end of season debriefing. I'm asking you now to please take just a few minutes of your time to respond to that anonymous survey, because it's your experience as an individual listener that's important to me. Just go to the approfessor.org/survey. And as always, thanks for your support. A searchable transcript and a captioned audiogram of this preview episode are funded by AAA, the American Association for Anatomy, at anatomy.org. Don't forget that if you're already a member of HAPS, you can join AAA for a greatly reduced rate. Check it out at anatomy.org and click the Membership tab. Well, this is Kevin Patton signing off for now, and reminding you to keep your questions and comments coming. Why not call the podcast hotline right now at 1-833-LION-DEN. That's 1-833-546-6336. Or visit us at theapprofessor.org. I'll see you down the road. Support for this preview episode comes from the American Association for Anatomy, the Human Anatomy and Physiology Society, and the Master of Science in Human Anatomy and Physiology Instruction.